The first real fortune does not begin when your money starts feeling large. It begins when your money stops depending mainly on your labor to keep moving. That threshold for most ordinary people is not $1 million. It is the first $100,000. Now, I want to be careful with that number because the public loves turning thresholds into mythology. People hear the first $100,000 and they start acting as if the number itself is magical, as if somewhere between $99,999 and $100,001 a secret door opens, and the universe begins treating you differently. That is not the right way to think about it. The number is not magical. The mechanics are, that is the point. The real reason net worth begins to feel different after $100,000 is not because the world suddenly respects you more. It is because for the first time your money starts becoming large enough that its own movement matters in a way your life can actually feel. Until then, most of the journey is still being carried by your behavior, your savings rate, your discipline, your willingness to say no, your ability to live below your means even while the culture around you spends as if tomorrow will negotiate. Before $100,000, your labor is doing most of the lifting. After $100,000, capital begins volunteering. That is the whole story. And once you understand that, the first 100,000 stops looking like a random milestone and starts looking like what it really is, the first escape velocity. This is one of the most important ideas in all of personal finance because most people misread the early phase of wealth building so badly that they quit emotionally before compounding has even had a chance to introduce itself properly. They look at the first years and think the machine is weak. They look at their account and think the math is too slow. They save, contribute, cut, sacrifice, and all they seem to get in return is movement so small it feels insulting. The portfolio is up, yes, but not enough to change a life. The savings account grows, yes, but not enough to quiet the fear. The retirement statement is larger, yes, but not large enough to make anybody feel transformed. That is where most people become vulnerable, not when the money is gone. When the money is growing too slowly to feel emotionally convincing. This is why the beginning matters so much. It is not only a financial stage, it is a psychological siege. The early years of wealth building are where the compounding machine still looks like a fraud. Your effort is obvious, your progress is not. You are making deposits that feel large to you and tiny to the future. You are saying no to things that feel real in the present in exchange for gains that still look invisible in the account. You are doing all the hard human work and getting very little visible magic in return. That is what makes the first $100,000 such a brutal threshold. It is not hard only because the number is big. It is hard because you must cross most of it under conditions where your effort and your rewards still look badly mismatched. The public usually explains this with some version of the penny doubling story. Fine, I understand why the story is simple and emotionally sticky. A penny doubles, then doubles again, and by the time your attention finally wakes up, the curve has already turned vertical. What matters in that example is not the penny. What matters is the insult of the early days. The first stretch is so unimpressive that almost nobody would believe it contains an explosion. That is how wealth feels in real life. The early stage is humiliatingly slow right before it becomes surprisingly fast. That is why I say the first $100,000 is not a money test. It is an endurance test. Can you remain loyal to a machine that still does not look generous? Can you keep buying while the process still feels underwhelming? Can you tolerate the years when you are clearly doing the right thing and still feel behind? That is the real question. Once you answer yes long enough, the whole experience changes. Now let me explain why. If you save $10,000 in a year and earn a 10% return, then in year one your return is trivial relative to your effort. You are the engine, the market is a sidekick. You did the work, the portfolio merely nodded. Then year two comes. You still save, the account grows. But again, most of the story is still you. You are still dragging the machine. The machine is not yet carrying you. This goes on for a while, and because it goes on for a while, people make the most dangerous mistake in the wealth game. They judge the machine too early. That is like judging an airplane during the last seconds of the runway acceleration and concluding that it will never leave the ground because it is still touching pavement. Of course, it is still touching pavement. That is how takeoff works. The moment the portfolio reaches more meaningful size, the experience starts changing. Your contribution still matters, yes. But now the return itself becomes visible enough to alter the emotional picture. A 10% gain on $100,000 is no longer symbolic. It is not some decorative number in the margin. It is a force. It is a new participant in your life. The portfolio begins producing an amount of movement large enough that your labor is no longer alone in the room. That is the shift. The source says it very directly in simple numerical form. And the math is worth respecting. The first $100,000 takes years because most of it comes from what you saved yourself. The next $100,000 can come faster, then faster still. Not because the universe became kinder, because a larger base changes the rate at which growth becomes visible. What was once almost entirely earned wealth slowly becomes a partnership between earned wealth and owned wealth. That is how people really get rich, not by one leap, by surviving the phase where the machine still looks weak until the machine grows large enough to stop needing so much help from them. This is why I think the majority of personal finance culture still teaches the wrong lesson. It teaches people to become impressed by the destination instead of becoming loyal to the phase that makes the destination possible. It tells them to stare at millionaires and billionaires instead of staring honestly at the ugly middle years where the habits were formed, the boredom was endured, the sacrifices were made, and the account still did not look like it justified the discipline. The first 100,000 is where that boring middle becomes a force. That is why Charlie Munger used to talk about it so bluntly. He was not being theatrical, he was being mechanical. The reason the first $100,000 feels like such a curse is because you are still mostly a wage-powered organism pretending to be a capital-powered one. The reason the next phases feel easier is because capital begins to pull its own weight. That is why rich people stay rich so much more easily than poor people become rich. This is a deeply unfair truth, but it is still true. The person with money has help from his balance sheet. The person without money has only behavior, and behavior is exhausting. That is why I refuse to romanticize the early stage. It is not noble because it is difficult. It is difficult because it asks you to do nearly all of the pushing yourself. A person under $100,000 is mostly trying to outrun gravity with savings. A person above $100,000 is beginning to get some lift from the machine that does not make the second person morally superior. It makes the second person mechanically advantaged. That distinction matters because it removes shame from the early struggle. Many people think the early stage feels hard because they are weak. Often it feels hard because it is structurally designed to feel hard. That is the whole point of compounding. It rewards size, and before size arrives, you are still stuck paying the toll in labor, patience, and time. This is why I say the first $100,000 does not mainly test intelligence. It tests obedience to a process that is not yet flattering you. The source makes another point that is so obvious people often miss how important it is. Most of the first $100,000 does not come from returns. It comes from what you work for and save. That matters because it changes where your attention should go below $100,000. The public gets too obsessed with investment brilliance, which ETF, which stock, which timing pattern, which next hot thing. Fine. Those things matter eventually. But in the first stage, the portfolio choice is often not the central issue. The central issue is your savings engine. How much can you keep? How fast can you pile principal? How many years are you wasting because your income is too small, your spending is too loose, or your seriousness is too inconsistent? That is the honest conversation. The people who say they want to get rich but refuse to confront their savings behavior are not serious. They are fans of the outcome, not students of the mechanism. The first 100,000 is built more by retained effort than by market genius. That means the beginner's highest return move is often not finding a slightly better investment. It is increasing the amount of capital available to be invested in the first place. That brings me to the second machine, income. This is where most people's wealth plans quietly die because they over-focus on cutting and under-focus on earning. Frugality matters. I like discipline, I admire restraint, but there are limits to what subtraction can do. A household can cut the obvious nonsense, cut the pride spending, cut the subscriptions, cut the convenience leaks, cut the status theater, and still find itself with too little left over because the income side of the equation was never strong enough to support the desired speed that matters even more today because the cost of living is no longer a small nuisance. Housing, insurance, food, transport, and the 1,000 little tolls of adult life have become aggressive enough that many ordinary people are already close to bare bones. Once a person is cut down to essentials, there is not much left to optimize except the income side. That is why I tell people the path to the first $100,000 is usually two-pronged. Spend less than you make, then make more than you used to. The first prong creates room, the second creates acceleration. And acceleration matters because every year you delay the first $100,000 is another year you delay the part of the curve where money finally starts carrying more of the load for you. That is the hidden cost of under-earning, not just that you have less today, that you arrive later to compounding. This is a very expensive delay. Now let us talk about the thing the source calls the two-pronged approach, because beneath the surface, it is pointing at a very practical structure. First, build productive equity exposure. Second, build a down payment path for a home. If your life and geography make that sensible, that is not a bad framework at all if you understand what each machine is doing. The stock market gives you scale, liquidity, and productive compounding. A home bought sensibly can give you leverage, force discipline, and exposure to inflation in the right direction rather than the wrong one. But even here, I want to add something the public often forgets. The home is not a substitute for investing. It is a second engine, not a replacement engine. Too many people hear that a house can build wealth and conclude that they may ignore the stock market until they become homeowners. That is not wise. You want both if possible because they solve different problems. The market teaches you how to own productive claims. The home teaches you how leverage and shelter can work on your side instead of against you. Together they can become powerful. Separately, they often leave a person too exposed to one kind of risk. This is why I like the Source S insistence on getting started in retirement accounts, using employer matches, using the Roth IRA, and leaning into broad index funds beneath the educational wrapper. The point is brutally simple. Start the compounding engine early, even if the early years feel unimpressive, because the unimpressive years are the price of admission to the explosive years later. That is exactly right. People keep waiting until they have more money to invest, but the early phase is supposed to feel too small. That is how it works. The first years are not there to flatter you. They are there to establish the base. The person who delays because the early results look boring is making the same mistake as the person who plants a tree and then uproots it in the first year because the shade is disappointing. The shade always comes later. That is what trees do. That is what compounding does. You endure the stage when it looks like nothing. Then one day it looks like something. Then one day it looks like a lot. And by then the person who delayed is no longer competing with your contributions alone. He is now competing against your time. Time is the great unfair ally in this game. And the first $100,000 is the point where time starts visibly taking your side. This is why I say net worth does not explode after $100,000, because the number is lucky. It explodes because by that point, the pile is finally large enough to make the annual percentage changes emotionally real. The account no longer needs every dollar of growth to come from your paycheck. The account begins generating more of its own future. That is what makes the second $100,000 feel easier, the third easier still, and the later years shockingly fast by comparison. This is also why the rich often sound smug when they talk about compounding. They are speaking from the phase where the machine is already helping. They forget how lonely it felt at the beginning. That is why I will not let them write the whole story. The full story must include the grind. It must include the months where nothing seems to happen. It must include the years where the account is still too small to impress anyone but large enough to ask you for sacrifice. It must include the annoyance of saying no while other people spend yes. It must include the fatigue of trying to save with inflation biting the ankles. It must include the reality that the first $100,000 is built less by genius than by dullness repeated correctly. That is the truth. And the truth is actually more encouraging than the fantasy, because genius is scarce, dullness repeated correctly is available to many more people than they think. Now, I want to say something about net worth itself, because people throw the term around too casually. Net worth is not your salary. It is not your income brag. It is not your house estimate alone. It is not the fantasy value of your future startup idea. It is what is left when liabilities are stripped away from assets. That is why net worth matters so much. It has no taste for performance art. The reason I care about the $100,000 net worth threshold is that it is the first time many people become materially harder to kill financially. The emergency fund is not symbolic anymore. The investment accounts are no longer decorative. The house equity, if any, starts becoming a real component of balance sheet strength. The person begins moving through the world with some actual financial density. That density changes behavior. You negotiate differently, you think differently. You stop treating every surprise like a mortal threat. You start understanding that money is not just for spending, it is for reducing fragility. That is another hidden reason the first $100,000 matters so much. It is not only a compounding threshold, it is a stability threshold. A person below it is often still too exposed to random life. A person above it is not invulnerable, but at least life can no longer insult him as easily with every medium-sized inconvenience. That calm matters, and calm, once introduced into a financial life, often improves behavior further. You stop making desperate choices. You stop swiping to smooth every inconvenience. You stop pretending that the future is a hostile stranger. You begin acting more like an owner and less like a person being chased. This is where wealth starts becoming self-reinforcing. Not because money has magic powers, because reduced fear improves decision quality, improved decisions preserved money compounds. That is the good vicious cycle the source points toward. But again, the cycle does not begin by accident. It begins with sacrifice. That is why I do not mind the source as tough. Love tone when it reminds people that getting to the first $100,000 requires discomfort. It is supposed to. If it were painless, everyone would cross it quickly and the whole threshold would mean less. The reason it matters is because it forces a person to become more organized than the culture around him, more patient, more serious, less interested in performance consumption, less willing to outsource joy to purchases, more respectful of retained capital. That character change is not an accessory to the first 100,000. It is the main ingredient. A person who can reach that threshold honestly has usually already changed enough that the later thresholds become more likely almost by character alone. That is what the public misses. The first $100,000 is not only the moment money starts helping, it is also the proof that you became someone money can trust. That is a much more valuable transformation than people realize, because once you become that person, your habits start compounding too. Your savings habit compounds, your investment discipline compounds, your resistance to stupid debt compounds, your ability to say no compounds. Your sense of what matters compounds. That is why the second 100,000 so often feels easier. It is not only that the base is larger, the owner is better. Now let me tell you what I would do if I were trying to reach the first $100,000 as fast as possible. I would keep the investment side boring, broad index funds, retirement accounts, automatic contributions, take every match, use tax advantages, do not waste precious. Early capital trying to prove brilliance, and I would make the behavior side severe, but sane live below the image, increase income aggressively. Stop pretending tiny luxuries are harmless when they delay the threshold that changes the whole curve. Preserve cash where you must, but do not keep large sums hiding from productive assets once your emergency structure is sound. If buying a home in your market is rational and you plan to stay, I would build the down payment with real discipline and think of the property as part of the balance sheet engine, not just as a lifestyle trophy. And above all, I would stop asking how to get rich quickly. I would ask how to reach the first compounding threshold without breaking the process. That is the real game. Not speed for its own sake, escape velocity. The source closes by saying, trust the math, trust the process. Good, that sounds simple, but it is exactly the right sentence. Most people trust the process only after the process flatters them. Too late. The whole secret is trusting the process while it is still boring. That is when trust is expensive. That is when it matters, because by the time net worth starts exploding, the hardest test is already over. The hardest test is believing in the machine before it has done enough to make belief emotionally easy. That is why the first $100,000 matters. Not because the money itself becomes magical, because by the time you reach it, the machine is finally strong enough to be felt. And once it can be felt, the future begins accelerating in a way the early years never could make you believe. That is what people mean when they say wealth explodes after $100,000. They do not mean the laws of finance suddenly change. They mean that for the first time, your money is finally large enough to stop behaving like a passenger and start behaving like a worker. That is the threshold. That is the secret, and that is why I would tell any young person, any late starter, any frustrated saver, any tired investor the same thing. Do not worship the explosion. Respect the runway, because the runway is where almost everybody quits, and the explosion only belongs to the people who kept moving while it still looked slow.